Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted and privileged to welcome a very, very accomplished professional from Florida, USA, Dr. Gena Cox. Gena, welcome to the show.
And thank you for having me. It is really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Cox is an organizational psychologist, an executive coach, and a speaker. She's an author, and all of you know I'm very partial to authors. She's an author of a book titled Leading Inclusion, and we'll talk a little bit about her book. Dr. Cox also uses organizational psychology and executive coaching insights, her understanding of C-suite dynamics, and her workplace experiences to share fresh and powerful insights to help leaders drive inclusion from the top of their organizations. So, Gena, with such an amazing journey, let me first ask you to tell me about your own journey in brief.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, a little bit about you from, reading about you and studying about you. And there are some similarities in that, I was actually born in England. My parents were part of that generation of people who had gone from the colonies to England in the 1950s, and that was where they met. But they were from the Caribbean. And then at some point, we went back to the Caribbean. So I spent most of my formative years in the Caribbean and, studying up to A levels and so on. And then I came to the United States. And the focus on psychology has always been an interest of mine, although my initial career preference was to be a journalist. And my parents said, bad idea, journalists, it's a very tough lifestyle. Pick something else and you can write about that. So you'll still get to write. And so I've as I came to the United States when I was about 20 years old, and I've lived here ever since. But my perspective on everything that I do is significantly influenced by the fact that I was, born in one place, grew up in another, and live in a third country. And I'm very curious about the world.
Fascinating. So, you also do a lot of work on inclusion. And let me start by, talking about your book first. So before I ask you about your book, for my viewers and listeners, I'm assuming it's available on Amazon.
It is. It certainly is.
Okay, so I'm going to ask all my viewers and listeners to go and check out
Thank you.
Dr. Cox's book. I will go and check it out myself. But tell me a little bit about the book and your hypothesis when you wrote it.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you, I love books and I read a great deal. And the great American writer, Toni Morrison, once said, if there is an idea that you think needs to be out in the world, I'm paraphrasing here, and you don't see it being represented, then you need to write that book yourself. And so the book that I wrote called Leading Inclusion is really primarily focused at an audience of executives, board directors, MBA students, people who lead an enterprise and want to be effective at leading everybody in that enterprise. Now, this was not my long-term focus. My focus has always been leadership, but and you'll see as I go along a little further that the reason the book is called Leading Inclusion is that some people say, well, is this a diversity and inclusion book? And I say, well, it is a diversity and inclusion book to the extent that you think diversity and inclusion is a thing over there. But because I think of these issues as leadership issues at the core, this is a leadership book. And it came out of the idea that after the spring of 2020, when there were so many horrible social injustices that had come to the fore, especially in the United States, and all about the death of George Floyd and so on, I asked myself, what could I do to make a positive impact on the world? Because that's what my goal in life is all about. Correct. And as I thought about that, it might not be walking in the streets, it might not be protesting, it might be, Gena, you've got varied experiences, you've got a particular kind of training in human behavior, you spend all your life in corporations, you understand this issue from that perspective. Maybe you should write a book to help business leaders process some of what they're seeing at more of an emotional level so that they really kind of pause and get introspective. So my book is not a how-to book with 10 steps. My book is what I call a how-to-be book, encouraging people to think a little bit about what really matters and what mindset do they need to have to take meaningful action.
Fascinating. And, when I was reading about you, you also say enhancing inclusion is imperative in today's workplaces. And this leadership must come from the top.
Yeah.
And I've often heard when I've spoken to a lot of corporate leaders, and this is, well, I've told my HR head to have some diversity and inclusion. Now it's her or his job to do it. I'd love to get your perspective on this particular quote from you.
Yeah, well, what you just said is what is actually the norm. And I'm taking a bit of a global view on this, not just the US view, although the US view is certainly the perspective that I know the best, because this is where I live and work. But here's the thing. From my observation over the decades, what I recognized was that whenever these words diversity, equity, and inclusion came up, first of all, they evoked an emotional reaction that tended to be one where a majority of people wanted to run away from it. That's the first thing I noticed. Why was that? I was curious. The second thing was that ever since, especially since the 1960s, we've been talking about these issues in organizations, but everybody agrees the progress has been slow, has been disappointing, and has been halting even since May of 2020. And so one of the things that I sincerely believed was the reason for that, and I had believed this forever because I spent a lot of years measuring employee opinions on behalf of my clients across the world. And what I observed from measuring employee opinions across the world was that there tended to be these patterns where, regardless of where you were, there always tend to be the folks who have more power tended to be more engaged than the ones who had less power, regardless of race or ethnicity. That was true. And in the United States, for example, we would see definite patterns by race and by gender in particular, where white males tended to be more engaged and having a more positive experience, and people of color and women tending to be having less positive experiences. And so we've known this for a long time. What has not happened, what has not mattered, is that all of the programs that have been implemented in all these years haven't made any difference. And that's because these so-called programs have been programs. They have been things off to the side where there would be a sort of an idea of the day and everybody would run with that idea. Implicit bias training is a perfect example, where you have a problem, everybody knows what the problem is, they're looking for solutions, and they grab whatever comes along. And so in the last couple of years, there's been this overemphasis on implicit bias training. There's nothing wrong with implicit bias training, except that the data is very clear that, number one, it can cause some people to be very defensive. The very people you want to be involved can get defensive. And secondly, it doesn't usually have a long-term impact on behavior change. So we know this, right? But it persists because there's no one in organizations where there is no strategic perspective, no one from the top that says, here's the challenge in our organization. Here's what we need as the outcomes that we are going to drive to in the next year or whatever the period of time is. Here are the things that we're going to establish as the actions that we will take starting at the top to drive to those outcomes. And here's how I want my leaders and managers to be accountable for the things that they will do consistently to scale this as a way we do business, not as a program or a project. So if absent a strategic perspective led from the top, there will be a lot of money spent and there will be minimal positive impact on the problem you're trying to solve.
Thank you. What a great response. And yet, I was speaking to many women leaders who are sitting on, inside boardrooms. And some of them actually said, we have a place at the table, but we are not included in the discussions.
Yes.
So to meet maybe a larger societal kind of a challenge, boards have said, let's get women into the boardrooms. But then, so they have a seat at the table, but they're not getting participation in discussions. I'd love to get your perspective.
Well, first of all, the idea that there is equitable representation even at the gender level in boardrooms is not what I'm seeing in the data across the world. Now, and in the United States, far from equity, in terms of representation in the boardroom, what we're seeing is a pushback against the efforts to increase the representation of women in boardrooms. For example, recently in the state of California, one of our more progressive states, we have a situation where legislation that would have required this level of equity, it was turned down. It was denied by their parliamentarians, and so there's still a lot of work to do. In fact, if you look at the United Nations Social Development Goal and you look at goal number 5, which is equity, gender equity, what the last report said is that it will take that as of 2030, which was the initial date, the goal of gender equity by 2030. Far from that, as a result of COVID, as a result of economic, as climate change in places where there are a large number of women in jobs, in lower paying jobs, what's going to happen is that we won't reach gender equity by 2030. In fact, things will be worse today in 2030 than they are today for this gender equity issue. And I just read a funny little story yesterday that in Australia, all of a sudden, they're noticing that they're in a situation where they might end up with fewer women on boards than they've ever had. So I thought that was very interesting. So representation is one challenge. You want to the goal is to keep working towards getting representation that looks like whatever the available workforce is, by gender, by race, by whatever. But then inclusion is a whole separate issue, which is why this book is called Leading Inclusion, because inclusion is about being seen, being heard, being valued, right? Having impact. That's what inclusion is about. And so I'm very interested in that day-to-day experience. And so consistent with what you just said to me about what those women say to you, I know from my own experiences and from the data that even when you could be present in a situation, if the organization has not established some norms that say everybody who shows up in this organization is seen, heard, and valued for whatever they do, they're given equal, time at the microphone, equal time to speak, equal access to the training and development opportunities, and so on, then in the end, what you have is a situation where I think I describe it as like being invited to a dinner party only to discover there's no placed setting for you. You walk around the table, there's nothing that has Gena's name on it. You're in the room, you're represented, but now it's very awkward. And then you realize, wait a minute, the person who set the dinner table up didn't think about me when they set this dinner table up. So inclusion, there's a lot of work yet to be done in helping people, even when they are selected into situations where they might not have traditionally been, to then be able to be there to optimize their contributions.
Fascinating. My next question to you is, and again, when I was reading about you, is that I wanted to ask you, what is the connection between leading inclusion and the Great Resignation?
Yes, the Great Resignation, a term coined by another organizational psychologist. Yes. Well, what I learned from the research I did in preparation for my book, of course, is that the Great Resignation is real, and it continues, by the way. And when initially people were saying that people were leaving their jobs because, they didn't want to work as hard, or they had discovered that they could work from home and maybe sort of, dodge, the responsibilities or what have you. There was talk about people want flexibility, which certainly people want, and so on. But ultimately, what the data is indicating, and I mentioned some of these things in my book, is that what people are really looking for is the opportunity to do meaningful work and still feel as if they're respected as they do it. So people are leaving jobs, and yes, some people are leaving jobs because they see an opportunity for a promotion and see an opportunity for more pay. That's just human nature. That is happening. Yeah. But when you really talk to people, those who are at the bottom of the economic ladder, or those who are sort of disadvantaged by virtue of being in a certain social group or what have you, when you ask them why they are leaving, what they would say is that they don't feel respected in their current place, and they're looking for more of that in the next. So there are all of these things happening. The Great Resignation is there's not one single factor, but I think of this as a shift in the way employees are thinking about work in general across the globe. It's an opportunity, I think, where the old ideas from the Industrial Revolution that were very useful for that era may not be as useful today. I see that evidence of that in the Great Resignation. I see it in something that's called quiet quitting, where people say, I'm tuning out. I see it also in the United States in the resurgence of the unions, especially in organizations, for example, who would think Amazon and union, or who would think Apple and union. To me, these are indications that employees are looking for a new experience. Correct. So Great Resignation is related to inclusion to the extent that organizations that are inclusive can probably retain more people regardless of what they look like.
Right. Well said. Another related question is, again, something I've, picked up from something that you have written maybe, is why don't employees of color and others who are disadvantaged need or want diversity and inclusion programs? And programs
Yeah.
is in inverted commas.
Yeah, the word programs and initiatives comes up a lot when you hear
Mm.
this so-called diversity,
Yes.
equity, and inclusion, which
Yes.
I think, as I had said before, I don't believe in any of that. First,
Mm.
I don't believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And here's the reason why. No one who looks like me or who knows the social norm is that maybe they might be at a disadvantage. I would want a diversity and inclusion program, because what we're really looking for is a day-to-day experience. We're looking for that level of respect, being seen, heard, and valued by our immediate managers, who are the first, representatives of the organization that we interact with. We're looking for our colleagues to be able to look us in the eye. We're looking for our colleagues to be able to have a cup of coffee with us and feel as if everybody is just here to do the best they can. And you show up as a human, you automatically get that respect. That, I think, is what people are looking for. Now, the programs, whether it's implicit bias training or something else, I don't suppose that they're harmful, but what they do is they further separate out people, because the minute you say you're having a program, let's say it's aimed at Black people, people from South Asia, people from wherever, automatically the other people say, oh, well, that's not for me, right? That's something for them. And so, and apart from the fact that I don't think that they solve the problem, I think some of these efforts further alienate the people that they're meant to bring closer together. And in the United States, I don't know if this is true in the whole world, but there's a lot of talk about employee resource groups where people from various ethnicities get together and so on. And there are some benefits to that. But what I'm starting to see is that the ERGs are the next sort of battleground, because I'll give you a very specific example where people who are in ERGs that are based on a religion and people who are in ERGs that are based on, for example, LGBTQ plus status in the United States, say, oh, well, our ideas are competing. And now instead of now helping, so we have to be very careful that in our efforts to help people for whatever reasons, when we look at their variations, we really need to focus first on connecting people and less on the programs that are meant to somehow magically change the other people's perceptions of those people.
Well said. And, on another note, and we won't talk about it today, but I have often objected, you and I are both employees of people of color.
Yes.
And I've said, sorry, I'm not a person. I see the other person who may be of a different color. But this is a politically accepted phrase in the US. So I've often argued this with my friends in the US. Why am I being called someone of color? But that's another subject. But let me now move on. You also state that leaders should think of REDI rather than DEI. What is REDI and what is the difference?
Yeah. So you have to have an acronym, isn't that right? When you write a book, you have to have an acronym so people can remember. And while I was so sure that I know people are very much connected to this diversity, equity, and inclusion idea, the D, the E, and the I, I decided that I might not completely get rid of that because it might make it too hard to go from that completely and just throwing it out. So as I was doing my research for the book, I spoke to more than 30 business executives in the summer of 2020. And I also did a survey that year with about 500 working women, of whom 159 were Black women. And when I spoke to the executives, I asked them the question, what is it that is getting in the way for you leading inclusion efforts in your organization? And here's what they said. The first thing they said was, I'm not sure it belongs on my plate.
Right.
I'm just not sure. The second thing was my colleagues at my peer level who advised me, half of them say, you know what, this is a no-win situation. If you do something and people don't like it, you're criticized. If you do nothing, people don't like that, you're criticized. So maybe you should do either nothing or very little and just wait and see, and this thing will die down. That's my strategy, my recommendation. And the third thing they said was, I'm not sure that I understand what the people who are meant to be the beneficiaries of this effort, that would be people like me or women or whatever, I'm not sure I understand what they want from me. I'm not sure I understand. So they were being very honest with me.
Correct.
And so I took that. And so when I talked to then the women in the survey, that was a survey, and I said, well, what is it that you would like these leaders to understand, and what is it that you see them doing that's getting in the way? What the Black women in particular said, and I'll tell you why I focused on Black women. What they said was, we already know that this is what leaders think. We know that they are afraid of the issue. They think it's taboo. And furthermore, we can see in their behavior, not just their literal behavior, but their metaphorical behavior and their decision-making and their processes, that they avoid us and they avoid this issue. And we interpret that as disrespect. Once I understood that, I said, aha, disrespect. So what you're saying is you're looking for the opposite of that. You're looking for respect. So my model is what I say is a respect first model. R is for respect, E is for equity, D is for diversity, I is for inclusion. But simply respect first. It's the fundamental currency that matters.
Well said. Well said. I love this REDI definition: respect, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, Gena, I have time for 2 more questions for you.
Okay.
My next question relates to culture. You live in an incredibly diverse, culturally diverse country. I want to ask you, how does culture impact REDI?
Yeah. So culture definitely impacts. If you think about culture from that bigger, geographic perspective, if you look across the United States or look across the world, it's pretty obvious that the world is diverse. I mean, we don't look alike, even though we are humans. We're all the same. So we know that everybody kind of shows up in the workplace from all these various backgrounds. And the workplace is the one place where all these differences come together. So that's both a challenge. How do you manage a diverse workforce? But it is also the opportunity, because I say, if you can change your organization, if you can have an organization in which all of these people can thrive, you're going to have a positive effect, not only on your organization, but on the world, which is what I'm looking for. But more specifically then within organizational culture, it is really, again, organizational culture is it's the responsibility of the leaders of the organization. That's how culture gets defined. So when I walk into an organization and people, don't talk to one another, they don't share ideas, or they don't make decisions until somebody at the top tells them that they can make a decision, I already know the culture of that organization. And so leaders can define cultures of inclusion as well. A culture in which anybody shows up, gets that level of respect, and their day-to-day experience is one where they're seen, heard, and valued, which benefits the organization. And the opposite of that as well, they can say, and we will not tolerate from our managers or our colleagues any behavior that contradicts that kind of idea. I know it's simple, it's easy to say, not so easy to do, but if an organizational leader desires to have that kind of culture, they're the ones that have to lead it. And if you don't do that, all of this diversity that we just talked about, when it shows up in the organization, will just be butting heads, and it will not be productive.
Absolutely. Well said. And my last question to you, and this is for the many, many people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your incredible journey, or your book, your understanding of psychology, your understanding of inclusion, what would you say are 3 learnings or 3 lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away?
Yeah. And, for all of the fancy stuff that we can talk about on a systemic level with this work, I actually believe it all comes down to one-to-one interactions. So anyone can be inclusive and make a difference, because I have this little idea of the 3 C's that I have in my book: curiosity, connection, lead to comfort. Curiosity, connection, lead to comfort. Which is to say that you can't get to the comfort that we all desire. That inclusion ease is what I think we aspire to that. You can't get to the ease unless you connect, unless you want to know something about me, you connect with me, and then you discover in a one-on-one interaction, oh my gosh, we have more in common than we don't. That's just the human experience. So the most important thing is for people to think about that as the fundamental way that one changes the world. I'm very idealistic about that. I will not back down. Another idea, the second thing is, and related to that you'll notice the respect idea is not something complicated. It means that, as Maya Angelou might suggest, I show up in the space, and once I'm there, I'm a human. I get all the grace. I
Correct.
get everything that any human would get. And that is so important. And then the last thing I mentioned that relates to all of these simple ideas is goodwill. If I come on an interview or podcast, I'm assuming that this is going to be an experience where both parties in this conversation will support each other. When I go out into the world and I meet somebody at the grocery store, I expect that there will be something positive coming my way, and I'm putting something. That reciprocity of goodwill is an essential component, and all of us can do these things.
Well said. Well said. And on that note, and some of your amazing lessons, how important it is to have one-on-one interactions, your 3 C's, which are curiosity, connection, lead to comfort. And what you said very earlier as well, which is part of your REDI, respect is so critical. Thank you, Gena, for speaking to me. Thank you for talking to me about your book, Leading Inclusion. For viewers, the book is just behind Gena on the screen. Thank you also for talking to me about inclusion, your thoughts on diversity, about all the other things that you have been doing in this space. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck.
It has been an honor to be here, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.